Irena Gut was a young Polish woman who was living away from home at nursing school in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. Irena joined some of her friends and became a resistance fighter, trying to do some kind of good in the midst of so much chaos. But unfortunately, Irena and several of her friends were captured by German troops, taken back to their military base, and forced into hard labor. By 1942, things had gone from bad to worse. Jews were no longer just being killed in private chambers, but in the public square. And one day, Irena heard one of the military commanders saying that he needed to clean out all of the Jews that were working in their army base. Well, Irena had become friends with some of these Jews, and she knew that she had to act fast. Now, Irena had been offered a job by one of the military commanders to be the housekeeper in his home. And so she accepted the position. And in the first few days that she lived there, after he would leave for work each day, she began to smuggle her Jewish friends into his home. For the next 2 years, she would harbor 12 Jews in the house of this commander, right under his very own nose. Every day she would see him off to work, lock the door behind him, let her friends come out of their hiding place in a tunnel off of his basement. They would spend their day helping her cook and clean, and then they would go back into hiding before he would return home. In her book, Memories of a Holocaust Rescuer, Irena said, "They were like mice in a cheese shop, which was guarded by a sleeping cat." Well, unfortunately, a day came when Irena was in the marketplace and she felt herself shuffled along by the crowd into the town square. And there she witnessed the hanging of a Polish family, including their children, a family who were accused of harboring Jews. Well, in her terror and her anguish, she rushed home and she forgot to lock the door behind her. And when the commander came home, he opened the door and found Irena in the kitchen being comforted by 3 of her Jewish friends. She was terrified, of course, of what he was going to do, and so she begged him not to call the Gestapo, and he made her a deal. He said if Irena would become his mistress, she would have his silence. She agreed to the deal, and she lived this horrific nightmare for the next several months. And she never told her friends how she had bought their freedom because she knew that their honor could never accept it. Well, finally, in the spring of 1944, the war began to turn, and the Germans began to leave Poland, including the commander. And so finally, at long last, her friends were able to emerge from the home, and all 12 of them were alive and well. And one of the couples even emerged with a brand new baby. Now, Irena is one of so many folks who risked their lives to help innocents during World War II. And recently there was a campaign of sorts on social media to start to bring attention to these stories. They wanted to remind future generations of the bravery, the courage, and the sacrifice of these folks. And part of that sacrifice was compromising their integrity. They had to do things like lie and blackmail and bribe. And you know what? They were willing and glad to do it. But the interesting thing is, in this campaign, do you know what these folks are being called? Righteous rescuers. Such an interesting dichotomy, don't you think? And the perfect food for thought for us as we open up our Bibles again, this time to the book of Joshua, and we meet our next mother of the Messiah, Rahab. Joshua chapter 2. Now, at the beginning of the book of Joshua, Moses has just died, and so God is establishing Joshua as the new Israelite commander. And over again, God reminds Joshua of 2 things. Number 1, keep the law. See, Moses and his generation, they weren't so good at keeping the law, and the consequences for that is that they did not get to see the promised land. But Joshua is leading a new generation, possibly a more faithful generation, and God intends to keep his promise that he made long ago. He has a land for his people, a land flowing with milk and honey, and he would like for them to enjoy that, and the time seems to be now. But this takes us to God's second reminder to Joshua. Be strong and courageous. In other words, this is not going to be easy. You're going to have to fight for this, but keep the faith. Do what I say, no matter how crazy, and you will be blessed. So in chapter 2, we see Joshua pull a play from Moses' book, and he sends 2 spies into the land of Jericho to check things out and bring back a report of what they're up against. And here's what happened. Verse 1. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. "Go look over the land," he said, "especially Jericho." And so they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab, and they stayed there. Now, a couple important notes here. Number 1, Rahab was not a pretend prostitute like Tamar. She's the real deal. But number 2, I think it's important to understand the way that the Hebrew is written here. It indicates that Rahab's house was more like a hostel or a travel motel of sorts for those that would come into Jericho for business, those kinds of things. Now, certainly any traveler could have acquired her services, but the phrase, "and they stayed there," it really gives the impression that these 2 Israelite spies were there for one purpose: to rest up. So let's continue in verse 2. The king of Jericho was told, "Look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land." So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab: "Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. She said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I didn't know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up with them." But she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax that she had laid out on the roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan, and as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. It's so important that we understand the gravity of what just happened here. Rahab is not just toying with the authorities. If these spies would have been found in her house, she would not have been forgiven. This would not have been forgotten. She is committing an act of treason, and the results of treason is absolute death. This really is the most clear possible way that Rahab could declare, "I renounce all authority in Canaan, and I place myself under the authority of the Most High God." This is such a big deal that her act is repeated in verses 4 and 6. It says that she hid them 2 times. And this isn't just bad editing by the writer. This is intentional emphasis. It's as if the author of this narrative is leaning in and saying, "Did you hear what I said? She hid them." This is a very big deal. Let's keep reading. Verse 8. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, "I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites, east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below." This is Rahab's confession of faith, and it's absolutely beautiful. Not only is this one of the longest consecutive statements made by any woman in any biblical narrative, but it's also quite poetic in nature. This has what we call a chiastic structure, or basically a movement that looks like this. A, B, C, C, B, A. Here's what I mean. She begins by saying, "The Lord has given you this land." And then she says, "Great fear has fallen on us." She goes on to describe that fear in even more detail by saying, "We are all melting in fear because of you." And in verse 10, she explains why this is the case. Because they have heard. They have heard of the Israelites' God. They have heard what he's done. They recognize his power and his authority. They see that the Israelite God might actually be more powerful than their gods, their Canaanite gods. And then she makes her way back out. She says, "Our hearts have melted in fear." You see the connection there. She says, "Our courage has failed us." And then she ends where she began by saying, "The Lord is God." He is God in heaven and on earth. Now, not only is her statement beautifully poetic, beautifully written, beautifully stated, and bracketed by the power of God. But I also want you to notice Rahab's use of the term we here. We know what your God has done. We have heard. And yet, Rahab is the only one standing there in the truth of the Almighty God. Rahab is the classic example of stand up for what you believe in, even if you are standing alone. Because yes, they have all heard the stories from Egypt about the plagues that destroyed the nation, about the sea that parted in two. They have heard about their march on other cities and their defeat of these enemy kings. But the citizens of Jericho have chosen to put their faith in their walls and in their weapons. But Rahab recognizes there is no wall so tall, so thick, so wide that it can rival Israel's God. And so it would seem that there are two types of fear in the land. The citizens of Jericho are afraid. But Rahab, she is in awe. In fact, at this point in the story, Rahab might be even more confident in Yahweh's power and plan than the two Israelite spies standing in front of her. When she says, I know that the Lord has given you this land, that is in the perfect tense. Or in other words, she's saying this is a done deal, an established fact. In fact, even Joshua might be questioning this. Otherwise, these two spies wouldn't be standing in front of her right now. And so since she's so confident that destruction is coming, here's where she goes next. Verse 12. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. Our lives for your lives, the men assured her. If you don't tell what we're doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. So she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. She said to them, go to the hills so that the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, and then go on your way. So these men make Rahab swear a 3-part promise. First of all, she has to hang a scarlet cord in her window. That will be the sign that that is the house that needs to be saved, that needs to be rescued. Secondly, she has to make sure that all of her family are inside her house. They will not be responsible for anyone out on the streets. And third and finally, she cannot tell anyone about their conversation or their plans. And in verse 21, it says, agreed, she replied. Let it be as you say. So she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in her window. And just like that, the harlot becomes the hero. Except for that she cuts this weird deal at the end. Now, this moment might make you question Rahab's sincerity in aligning herself with the God of the Israelites. Is she just doing this so that she can be spared? I don't think so. Because remember what she just did. Again, if those spies would have been found in her home, she would have faced death probably in that moment. So I don't think this is about life or death for Rahab. For Rahab, this is about truth. But I also want you to note the order of things here. First, Rahab makes a faith proclamation, and then she makes her plea. In essence, she says, because I believe in God, I believe that he can save me. But man, I think we tend to do this the other way around. Do you know what I mean? We try to cut a deal with God first, and then we make a faith decision. Well, God, if you'll just give me this job, then I promise I'll go back to church. God, if you'll just heal this disease in me, then I will devote my life to you till the end of my days. Dr. Tony Evans, he's a fun preacher to listen to. He says, when we operate in that order, we're singing the wrong song. That's backwards, Christian soldiers. But we can learn from Rahab here. We need to see God for who he is, revere God for who he is, stand in awe of his power and his might, and then make whatever request you have. But if you believe that he is all-powerful, then trust him to work out the details. Well, now, over the next several chapters, the plan is put in place. The spies report to Joshua. They tell him the Lord has given us this land. And so Joshua leads the people forward. And when they get to the Jordan River, this new generation gets a taste of what their ancestors experienced at the Red Sea. The priests pick up the Ark of the Covenant and they step into the water. And when they do, the flow of water stops and everyone crosses to the other side. When they get there, Joshua commands one man from every one of the tribes to collect a large stone, and they build a memorial of thanks to God for his provision. And then the fun begins. The Israelites now march around the walls of the city one time each day for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, they march around 7 times. And here's where we'll pick up the story in chapter 6, verse 20. It says, when the trumpet sounded, the army shouted. And at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her in accordance with your oath to her. So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother, her brothers and sisters, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab, the prostitute, with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. Fun fact, in the Hebrew text, 86 words are devoted to Rahab's rescue, while the destruction of Jericho occupies 102 words. One could say that the salvation of Rahab was almost as equally important as the taking of this enemy outpost, which feels kind of wild, right? Because Rahab is a prostitute, and not just a prostitute, but she was a Canaanite, an enemy of Israel. All of the Canaanites were supposed to be killed. So her most exemplary quality is that she could tell a really convincing lie. I mean, can she really be this important? You know, many have chosen to enter into this big moral debate about Rahab's lies. Like, is her sin erased because of her confession of belief in the subsequent verses? Is that how this is working? Or does the fact that she's a Canaanite and a harlot kind of give her a pass? Like, as if lying is the least of her issues? But I think cycling around and around this question is kind of missing the point of the narrative. No, we don't need to be cavalier with her lies, no, but I also don't think we need to be too concerned. Because the point of this story is not about fault. It's about faith. The New Testament writer of the book of Hebrews, he created a hall of fame of sorts in chapter 11. And it starts at the very beginning, and it praises men and women of the Old Testament, all for one reason: their great acts of faith. There's Abel and Enoch, Noah and Abraham. Sarah makes it in there for trusting the Lord for a son in the midst of her barrenness and old age. Next comes Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses. And the author talks about the faith of the Israelites through the plagues and the Passover and the parting of the sea. But then all of a sudden, in verses 30 and 31, it says, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. And by faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. See, it goes on to name a few other names in Hebrews chapter 11, but actually Rahab's is the last one that gets a full description. After this, it kind of lists all the names, lumps them together, and says, I don't have time to talk about all of them. So this really is quite an honor. But I want you to notice here, nothing is said about her being deceitful or a liar or a schemer. No, actually, a lot of biblical scholars have spoken more about Rahab's qualities of hospitality and mercy and patience and repentance. And so perhaps instead of referring to Rahab as the harlot from Jericho, maybe from now on we can just call her a hero of Israel. Certainly seems like a better fit. And isn't that amazing? From this one little branch on Christ's family tree, a scandalous woman is sanctified and an entire nation is advanced. And it would seem that from the elevation in both the Old and New Testament texts, that God rejoiced equally over both of these victories. Now, maybe you're wondering if you have what it takes to make bold proclamations like Rahab, or to make bold moves like Rahab. Do you have the courage? Do you have the strength? I totally get that. I've questioned myself in that same way. But I think what Rahab's story teaches us here is that it is God who has all the power. It is God who split the sea, provided manna, and gave them water from a rock. It is God who led them by fire at night and by cloud by day. It's God who stopped the river waters and God who tore those walls down. It's God who sent the spies straight to Rahab's house on that first night and sent them there again to bring Rahab to her true home several days later. Rahab was courageous, yes, but only because her hope was in Yahweh. Can I share one more fun fact with you? The Hebrew word for hope is the word tikva. Tikva is the word for hope, but interestingly enough, it's also the same word for cord or rope. So when Rahab hung the scarlet cord in her window, this was not just a sign of the covenant with the spies, reminding him that she was the one to be rescued. No, it was also a symbol of where her hope came from, a reminder that she had already been rescued. My daughter recently made me a scarlet rope to hang in my office, a reminder to be strong and courageous when I am full of fear. And I call it my hope on a rope, because hope and rope is the same word, tikva. You should get yourself your own cord. It's helpful. Irena Gut was also asked how she found the courage to stand up to Nazi Germany and to do whatever she needed to do to protect innocent lives. And here's what she said in her book. She said, "Courage is a whisper from above." A whisper from above. And she said, when you listen with your heart, you will know what to do and how and when. And friends, I think Rahab would agree. So let's now all go in peace, be strong and courageous, and put your hope in the Lord.